The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
Ralph Waldo Emerson, sometimes known as the Sage of Concord, and Walt Whitman couldn't be more different in many ways, which I'll go into a little bit in my remarks. But Emerson wrote one of his many essays in the early 1800s was called The Poet, and in that essay he talked about the poet that America was waiting for, the poet that this experiment in democracy and government by the people was waiting for, and the fact that it was a new world. And then when Leaves of Grass was first published, the very first edition, and there have been many that expanded it both and has a different preface for each one, he wrote this letter to Walt Whitman. Dear Sir, I am not blind to the worth of the wonderful gift of Leaves of Grass. I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I am very happy in reading it, as great power makes us happy. It meets the demand I am always making of what seemed a sterile and stingy nature, as if too much handiwork or too much lymph on the temperament were making our Western wits fat and mean. I give you joy of your free and brave thought. I have great joy in it. I find incomparable things said incomparably well, as they must be. I find the courage of treatment which so delights us and which large perception only can inspire. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start. I rubbed my eyes a little to see if the sunbeam were no illusion, but the solid sense of the book is a sober certainty. It has the best merits, namely of fortifying and encouraging. I did not know until I last night saw the book advertised in a newspaper that I could trust the name, real and available for a post office. I wished to see my benefactor and have much felt like striking my task and visiting New York to pay my respects. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was at that point called the Sage of Concord, and it wasn't just for Unitarians at that point there were two separate denominations, that he was a voice of commanding respect. He, at one point, as probably most of you know, was a Unitarian minister. He grew tired of ritual. He felt that the communion service he was asked to include in his services was no longer meaningful. It had become for him a dry and unmeaningful ritual. And so he left the pulpit of his Unitarian church to be essentially a minister to the masses in America, and he would travel all over the country as it was at that point and gave lectures and was known as the official American wise man. But his Unitarian roots remained strong in many respects. He continued to go to church occasionally in his hometown of Concord, but he was always very critical of the minister there, a poor guy named Brazili Frost, for whom Emerson had the exact opposite response that he had to Leaves of Grass. He would refer to Brazili Frost as a man that you couldn't tell if he ever had put in a garden, loved a woman, loved a child, or had a life. And he referred to him sometimes as the face of corpse-cold Unitarianism. So the solution that Emerson and others had at that time in New England to the coldness and sort of puritanical nature of a lot of the Unitarian gatherings as well as other churches was sort of the gradual development of this philosophy called Transcendentalism. Now, Transcendentalism lives on strongly in our current UU world in the form of our first source, that sense of mystery and wonder that transcends ordinary experience. But we don't talk about it a lot. So I just want to digress a moment and say you guys are lucky that you have the combination of regular speakers that you do, because Reverend Edie, who speaks to you once a month also, and I, in many ways, while of course being both Unitarian Universalist ministers and sharing much in philosophy and so on, we come from very different eras of ministry. I was ordained over 20 years ago, but I've been dabbling and doing work in UU churches and going to school in a UU setting at Harvard for over, 32 or 3 years. And things have changed a lot. That doesn't sound that long ago. But at that point, the transcendentalist side of our history was very much evolving. Universalism was coming back to the fore as a more broader, as a broader interpretation of religion. And now, pretty much, we're mostly hearing about social justice, anti-oppression, anti-racism, sexism, multiculturalism, pro all of our gender expressions and so on, all of which are wonderful, laudable, and of course I am in favor of all of those things. However, out of that has come an alarming neglect, in my view, of the more spiritual aspects of our heritage, and I think some of the paucity of goodwill in our culture, to which we can attribute a lot of things and blame a lot of people, but we do, as religious liberals, and in many cases, but not always, political liberals, we actually have a lot to answer for ourselves. And I think the great sage Emerson and the amazing poet Walt Whitman have a lot to address us with in this era. They were both kind of, in some respects, somewhat overly optimistic about the possibilities of American democracy and the culture of the New World, but also they provided a voice that we could really make use of. In a way, I feel that Emerson was sort of the prophet of transcendentalism, and in his essay on the poet, as I said, he called for a new poet fit for the new time and the new place, i.e. the new world. And to some extent, you could say that Walt Whitman, although never, as far as I know, a Unitarian or a Universalist by actual commitment to a specific, church building or location or any kind of denominational affiliation, in many ways wrote a scripture for the new world and a scripture for both the political aspects of that world, and also a scripture for a new kind of religion. So Whitman was, as so many people were in America, came from a bit of a hardscrabble family. He was the second of 9 children, dropped out of school at 11, but already knew enough to be able to have something of a career as a printer and various things. I mean, can you imagine a kid dropping out of school at 11 nowadays and starting a career? That's a little, we've kind of infantilized our young people. But there was a time when 11, 12, 13-year-old people were essentially running farms, households, and often doing major professional kinds of work. So he took jobs as a printer. He roamed around New York City, had an insatiable thirst for reading and haunted libraries. And after the printing district burned down, he returned to Long Island and worked kind of unhappily as a school teacher. So again, imagine being a school teacher with whatever 4th, 5th grade education. But see, they learn more stuff. So many kids learn to read and speak Greek and Latin and several other languages by the time they were 10 or 11. We have really slacked off people in our intellectual rigor. Anyway, in 1855, Whitman self-published the first edition of Leaves of Grass. And one of the things Emerson had said in his essay, he said, "America is a poem in our eyes. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination, and it will not wait long for meters." In other words, it won't wait long for its poet. And as you heard in his letter, when he read the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he was quite sure that Whitman was that poet. The two of them, however, did not sustain a long relationship because Whitman was a person, let's just say that his boundaries were pretty loose. And Emerson, for all of his eminence and brilliance and stepping away from what he called the corpse-cold version of Unitarianism and embracing this larger sort of sense of world religion and the idea that all religions had something to offer, and that Jesus, while in his mind a great prophet, was not the be-all and end-all in religion. So he had broken a lot of boundaries, but he had his limits. And Walt Whitman didn't seem to have many limits. So you can look at Whitman as either a person lacking in sort of personal discipline or as a person open to welcoming all. One of the things he always said, one of my favorite quotes from his, is something about, "I am large, I contain multitudes." After having said that if he contradicted himself, that was okay, because he could live with all those contradictions. Emerson, it seemed, had a little more difficulty dealing with some of those contradictions. Now, a lot of you, of course, are aware that Whitman is known as having been more than likely homosexual, or at any rate bisexual, and maybe the word would be better, pansexual. We have a better vocabulary now for describing people's, the wide variety in the way people express themselves through gender and sexuality. But certainly, he was too much for Emerson. So when the second and third editions started coming out, and there were a lot of poems about sexuality, some of them seeming to feature female energy, and a lot about the comradely love between men, Emerson just sort of shut up. There were no more laudatory letters to Whitman. But nonetheless, as often happens in a culture, someone who is not quite ready to embrace the new completely does set the pace. We can think all the way back to the Old Testament when Moses led supposedly the tribes of Israel toward the Promised Land, but was never quite seen as qualified to go in due to the fact that he had occasionally offended God. So taking that story not literally but seriously, we can see that sometimes the person who leads us to something can't really lead us through it, and that was certainly the case with Uncle Ralph, as I always like to call him. So what did really Whitman do? Now, I know that, as I said, with my voice not being what it was, I don't want to read as much as I might otherwise have. Plus, we had a lot of joys and concerns, so that's actually good for me, I have to tell you. But I want to give you a little sense of the vastness of Whitman's oeuvre and how much, I hope you'll see from my small selection from this pretty substantial, this is pretty much the complete poetry and selected prose by Walt Whitman, edited by James Miller. I don't think there's a better one available, although this one is old. I've had it since I was in college, but I suspect it's been reissued or a better one. But this has pretty much all of Whitman that you'd ever need to know. So the first thing is that Leaves of Grass, although separate poems and separate sections, he saw it as a whole. He saw it in a sense, as I said, he might not have ever called it that, but he saw it as a scripture and a prescription for life. From the time that he conceived of it, he thought it was an attempt to create a new Bible. He was that clear about it for the modern world and for specifically the Western world, which of course we have to be careful of these days. He expressed the view that his work should be judged not as a literary effort, but as essentially a religious effort. The true poet for him was a prophet who seeks to express an appropriate religious vision. Primarily in his various prefaces and other prose works, but also in his poetry, Whitman frequently deals with this idea of the true poet, the mature poet, and he even sometimes refers to that true poet as the true son of God and the true poem. So just a tad from this idea. All this time, and at all times, wait the words of true poems. The words of true poems do not merely please. The words of true poems give you more than poems. They give you to form for yourself poems, religions, politics, war, peace, behavior, histories, essays, daily life, and everything else. They balance race, colors, races, creeds, and the sexes. They do not seek beauty, they are sought. The immortal poets of Asia and Europe have done their work and passed to other spheres. A work remains, the work of surpassing all that they have done. So you see how beautifully he sets up this idea that we do not want to dishonor the scriptures of the past, but we also need to keep writing scriptures for the future. Now, as you know, a lot of world religions do not put a lot of emphasis on individual selves. Historically, of course, there's some reasons for that, because individual selves often didn't live very long through much of human history. You probably know there was a time when people often didn't name their children until they were several years old because the chance of the child dying in early childhood was so strong. But of course, by the time Whitman and Emerson were floating around here in America, childbirth was still dangerous, but not as dangerous as it had been. And at least among certain classes of people, the chances of living to adulthood and being able to develop a fully unique and authentic self was greater. And that's certainly something Whitman celebrated. The prophetic vision of Whitman begins with a celebration of the self. Again, something a little bit innovative at that time. Stressing concreteness, Whitman begins with a celebration of himself, of course. But this concrete self, as seen, is not so much just him individually, but as sort of an archetype of the human self. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, and every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Underneath all, individuals. I swear nothing is good to me now that ignores individuals. The whole theory of the universe is directed unerringly to one single individual, namely you. Now, this was not, not common in those days at all. So he didn't even have to get to the part about writing pretty openly about sexual expression to be controversial. I mean, this just was something that we can't even grasp how new it is, since we live in such a world that glorifies individuals over the collective, although now, sad to say, in some of our current political directions, we seem to be going back to a disturbing tribalism. In celebrating the self, Whitman wants to celebrate all selves, everyone, the poor as well as the rich, the sick as well as the healthy, the sinner as well as the saint, etc., has a place in the procession in his mind. He says, I speak the password primeval, I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. Oh, you shunned persons, I at least do not shun you. I come forthwith in your midst. I will be your poet. I will be more to you than any of the rest. And for Whitman, the self is not an abstraction. It always finds expression in a body. And this, again, there certainly were mentions of romantic love and so forth, but we were living at a time just out of the Puritan era, and, embodiment was not a thing. But in his experience, it's always the embodied self that is central to his prophetic vision. He says, behold, the body includes and is the meaning. The main concerns and includes and is the soul. Whoever you are, how superb and how divine is your body, or any part of it. I have said the soul is not more than the body, and I have said that the body is not more than the soul, and nothing, not God, is greater to me than oneself. Well, blasphemy. Merciful heavens, this is a whole new kind of theology. And then, of course, I'm not going to read a lot of the purely sexually explicit ones, not because I think there's anything wrong with it, but I'm not sure I could really do them justice. He has a whole sections on women and their bodies and sexuality, of course, all kinds of things about the men that he regarded as his sort of comrades and lovers. And he celebrates, in addition to the body, the concreteness of life. He celebrates the embodied self finding actual expression in the world. Leaves of Grass in its fullness and essence is a celebration of being, a celebration of bodily earthly existence. He says, it seems to me that everything in the light and air ought to be happy. Whoever is not in his coffin and the dark grave, let him know he has enough. Thanks in old age, thanks ere I go, for health, the midday sun, the impalpable air, for life, mere life, for precious, ever-lingering memories. And he wrote that last little line when he was in his 70s. Now, Emerson and Whitman didn't really share, the same understanding of the importance and need to be open about bodily love and so on, but they did share this sense of what Emerson called everyday miracles, and what Whitman referred to as nothing else but miracles. From his perspective, miracles are assigned to the natural world and not the supernatural worlds. Miracles can be found all around us, and in this he and Emerson were totally in sync. Whitman says, "Why should I wish to see God better than this day? I see something of God each hour of the 24, and each moment then. And to me, every hour of the light and the dark is a miracle. Every cubic inch of space is a miracle. Every square yard of the surface of the earth is spread with the same. And a morning glory at my window satisfies me more than the metaphysics of books." One of the things that was a changing moment in Whitman's life was he was a nurse for a while during the Civil War. He went south because his brother was in the war and was wounded, and he went down and spent a lot of time nursing. And this is his statement on war. He says, "No more the sad, unnatural shows of war." He felt that the American Civil War was the central event of his lifetime. His experiences at the front when his brother was wounded, his ministry to wounded soldiers, and his experiences in Washington during the war, as reflected in his collection of poems called Drum Taps, shaped the social part of his prophetic vision. In a piece called The Wound Dresser, he says, "Aroused and angry, I thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war. But soon my fingers failed me, my face drooped, and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead." And another, "Were you looking to be held together by lawyers, or by agreement on a paper, or by arms? Nay, nor the world, nor any living thing will so cohere." And this is from a piece called Over the Carnage, Rose Prophetic of Voice. He also, like a lot of poets, seemed to be, as John Keats once said, half in love with easeful death, but mostly he seemed to embrace life in all of its messiness and challenge. He was a big fan, as was Emerson, of the natural world, and he was a huge proponent of the universality of all of us. Now, these were men of their time, and they were men. So some of their stuff about women, some of their stuff about race, and Whitman was really from a sort of working class origin, and Emerson was a patrician, but still they got a lot wrong about all those things: sex, race, class. They were definitely not past muster in the UUA these days, is all I have to say. But from the spiritual side, from looking at this from the transcendentalist part of our culture and that piece of our sources that we draw upon, they both had a lot to say. So on the idea of the gems or the beginnings of a greater religion, Whitman said this. He thought in terms of writing a new Bible, as I said earlier. He was attempting to articulate a new religious vision for the modern world. In the end, Whitman himself had to realize that he could not complete the task he had set himself. All he could do, he says, and starting from Paul Monach, was to drop in the earth the germs of a greater religion. And about this, he said, "Each by the hand and day to day, and ever so stands as blender, uniter, tightly holding hands, which he will never release until he reconciles the two, and wholly and joyously blends them." In terms of Whitman's prophetic vision, the route to an adequate religion for the modern world is through the world of science. Again, he fits with us very well and fits very well with the different sources that we draw upon. He says, "I accept reality and dare not question it. Materialism first and last, imbuing hurrah for positive science. Long live exact demonstration." And he says, "Whatever may have been the case in years gone by, the true case for the imaginative faculty of modern times is to give ultimate vivification to facts, to science. endowing them with glows and glories and final illustriousness which belongs to every real thing and to real things only. So while he may not have been an institutional Unitarian or Universalist, Whitman, I believe, still to this day embodies the basic values that we as Unitarian Universalists hold dear. And although Emerson may have not been able to stick with him all the way through, I think at this point in our history, we could say perhaps that we need to go, as Whitman himself understood, even a little further than he did. But he's certainly a great guide to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.